All right, MSDOSX, welcome back for another bonus lecture. Today, I'm going to be kind of giving some high-level talking points about Core Data, which is Apple's really pretty cool data modeling tool. So allow you to have pretty large backing data models for your applications, and they make it pretty easy. Although it's a bit complicated because it's a really big package. The documentation and their guides are really massive. It took me a while to just figure out what was important to pull out of it. So I'm kind of giving you guys some high-level points and pointing you to more documentation if you want to get more details. So, like I said, it's a tool for creating models, and this is like as in like the MVC paradigm, the M part of that kind of models. These kind of data models for your application. Some features is that it has built-in support for handling undo and redo, so you can manage this great big object graph. You can make modifications to this object graph, and it tracks all those changes so that way you can really, without any work, without you having to interface with the undo manager, it does all that for you, so you can undo and redo changes really quite easily. And it doesn't, it stores all those changes pretty efficiently. It does delta updates, so that way you're not storing copies for every time you do a change. It has automatic support for making sure that when you set property values on these model objects, that those are valid, that they make sense, and you can define what makes sense for each of these different values. One nice thing is that when you make changes to this object graph, it makes sure Core Data makes sure that those changes propagate correctly and that they get maintained consistently, so that even if you change the relationships between the different objects, that the object graph maintains consistent. It also allows you to filter and group and query your data model and kind of determine how you want to organize all your data. And probably most importantly is that it has a really nice interface for being able to store your data model back out to some more persistent data store like disk, for example. But it can be that external file can pretty much be anywhere, including up in the cloud, if you have some server that has it. So it's some prerequisite knowledge for how to use Core Data. This is straight from the documentation. They recommend, obviously, you need to know Objective-C. You need to be familiar with memory management and the delegation in MVC. And then there's this concept of key value coding and key value observing that I haven't talked about, and I'd like to add a lecture about that at some point. It's actually a fairly straightforward concept. It's sort of an informal protocol for you to query and set an object's properties by name rather than by a method call or by directly accessing an instance variable. So you just pass in strings, and there's this protocol for how you name those strings, and you can do objects within objects within objects within objects, and there's a really nice protocol for how to define that. Key value coding and key value observing is itself a very large topic that I don't have time for, and I didn't have time to make slides about it. So there's some links to how to do key value coding. Like I said, it's a fairly simple idea, but there's a lot of power to it. And Apple notes that key value coding is really useful not only for Core Data, but if you want to work with Cocoa bindings, which is this really cool way for if you have some user interface element whose value is logically bound to the value of some variable in your program, where every time you change the string, a label updates, for example. But there's a really nice way to bind those so that anytime you change the variable, the label updates automatically, which is really nice. And in order to use Cocoa bindings, you need to know how to do key value coding and key value observing, because that's how it's done under the hood. Is it uses key value coding. Another useful thing is if you want to make your application Apple scriptable, then key value coding is again pretty useful. Okay, so one of the core ideas of Core Data is what they call a managed object context. And so Core Data manages actually really a lot of functionality for you. Like I said, including interfacing with the undo manager, and doing things like maintaining persistence, making sure that it stays consistent and on disk and all those good things. And so, as Apple puts it, the managed object context is sort of your gateway into this great big stack of what they call the persistence stack, which is a collection of framework objects that basically act as intermediaries between the actual Objective-C objects in your code and the underlying backing store on disk or whatever. So there's several layers of abstraction of how to get between those two layers, and the managed object context is kind of the top level entry point into this stack of increasing abstraction down toward persistence. They describe it kind of as an intelligent scratch pad. So the idea is that you, in some way, read in values, probably from disk, whatever your backing store happens to be. You load these into your scratch pad, you make some changes to them, but none of those changes get committed back to the persistent store until you actually save them. And what's kind of nice is that the managed object context allows you to have pretty arbitrarily complicated object dependency graphs, and just all these objects live in this context, and you modify them, and then once you're ready to go, core data figures out how to save it, how to write it back out to disk, and you kind of basically abstracts you away from the actual storage of the data and lets you really just manipulate the data and then say save on it. So within a managed object context are what they call managed objects. These are your actual model objects that are going to be the basis of your application. In order for managed objects to actually work with core data, they have to be registered with a managed object context. Yeah, I'm sorry, the terminology is a little bit hard. It's even hard for me to say it correctly because there's a lot of very similar sounding words. But basically the idea is managed objects had to be part of the managed object context, so that way any changes to those get registered with core data, so that way they can get eventually committed back to the persistent store. So things like changing the values of different properties in these data models, changing the relationships between these objects. All these are things. These are all changes that can be tracked by the managed object context, assuming that all the objects are managed objects. Once you have an object graph, you can make fetch requests on that in this graph. So there are 3 parts to a fetch request. So this is how you get data out of the context. You must specify the name of the entity you're looking for. So if you have, for example, a database of employee records, you might be looking for a name. That'd be the entity you're looking for. You can optionally pass a predicate, which is some condition or conditions that you need to be satisfied by the values you get. So if I wanted all employees whose the first name starts with J, then I could pass, the entity would be name, and then I could have a predicate that's the first character has to be J. And then lastly, one or more sort descriptors, so that way when you get data back, you define what order you want those to come back in, so that way you can run through those results. Okay, so at the top of this persistence stack, like I said, we have the manage object context, which is this really high-level abstract way for you to manage objects. And all the way down at the bottom is the actual persistent object stores. So this might be an XML file, this might be a SQL database. It's just some way of storing things in some persistent way. And in between are what they call persistent store coordinators, which basically are your intermediaries. These are how the managed object context communicates down with the actual persistent stores to make changes. So potentially one persistent store coordinator will interface with several persistent stores. So you can imagine that it's going to depend on how core data decides to actually write your files out to disk. But it presents to the managed object context the illusion of one contiguous, coherent, consistent store of data, but it may actually be fragmented and broken up in different files depending on how the model is actually defined. Okay, so how do we define the objects that actually go into that actually become managed objects? Yeah, I know this is a little overwhelming. I still don't quite understand how to use core data very well. One really neat thing though is that there's this model, what they call managed object model, which is kind of the blueprint for what your managed objects are like. So it's very much like a class definition that's a blueprint for an object, but this is the blueprint for all the different models that you want in your project. And what's really neat is Xcode has a visual editor for editing data models. So just like Interface Builder is a great way to visually edit your interfaces, the Xcode data modeling designer, I believe, is a graphical way for you to design your data models, and you can literally like hook them together and define some pretty complicated object graphs pretty simply. just with a few clicks. But the idea is that it's basically just describes all the entities that are in your application. Things like the name of the entity, the class, the underlying class that it uses when it actually makes one of those objects, any properties it might have, and any relationships it might have to any other objects, being, you know, the parent-child sort of relationships, or those kind of things. Okay, so I know that was kind of super high level. I have some resources here at the end for things like key value coding and key value observing. This is kind of where they say to get started. They really superficial high level intro. There was a great big document. Actually, I think that's that one. But there's like the amount of documentation for core data is rather astounding. So just kind of to motivate why core data is cool, I ran through their simple little example and I'm going to show that to you.